Hello everyone and welcome back to the Tales of Terror. I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, please leave a comment to let me know where you are from in the world. Also, like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Now, let's get comfy and relaxed and begin. Story 1. The School Mystery. I moved to a small village in Maine a couple of years ago. It was a quiet place where everyone knew each other. I got a job teaching at the local school. It seemed perfect. Small classes, nice kids, friendly staff. I felt like I was finally settling into a good routine. But after a few months, I started noticing strange things. One of the kids, Billy, always seemed scared. He flinched whenever someone touched him, even just a pat on the back. I thought maybe he had issues at home. Then I noticed he wasn't the only one. A few kids acted the same way. One day, Billy came to school with a bruise on his arm. I asked him about it, but he just looked at me with wide eyes and said he fell. I didn't believe him, but I didn't push it. I decided to keep an eye on things. A week later, I was staying late to grade papers. The school was empty except for me and Mr. Thompson, the janitor. He was an old guy, friendly enough, but something about him always seemed off. As I was finishing up, I heard voices coming from the principal's office. It was odd because it was almost 9 p.m. and the principal had left hours ago. I crept down the hall and listened. I could hear Mr. Thompson and someone else talking in low voices. They mentioned Billy's name and a few other kids. My heart started pounding. I couldn't hear everything, but what I did catch made my blood run cold. They were talking about keeping the kids quiet and making sure no one found out what was going on. I quickly left the school, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. Should I go to the police? What if they didn't believe me? I decided to gather more evidence first. Over the next few days, I noticed more things. Kids were being taken out of class for special sessions with the principal or Mr. Thompson. Kids who seemed scared to go home. I started taking notes, writing down everything I saw and heard. I even managed to snap a few photos without anyone noticing. One night, I stayed late again, hoping to catch more of their conversation. This time, I brought a small voice recorder. I hid it in a closet near the principal's office and waited. Sure enough, they were there again, talking about the kids. I recorded everything, my heart pounding the whole time. As I was leaving, Mr. Thompson came around the corner and saw me. His eyes narrowed, and he asked what I was doing there so late. I stammered something about grading papers and hurried out of the school. I knew I was in trouble. He had seen me and probably suspected something. The next day, I found a note in my mailbox. It was a warning, telling me to mind my own business or else. I was terrified. I knew I had to do something but didn't know what. I decided to go to the police with the recordings and my notes. The police were skeptical at first, but when they heard the recordings and saw my notes, they took me seriously. They promised to investigate, but I was still scared. I didn't know if they could protect me. A few days later, I noticed a car following me. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew it wasn't. That night, I heard noises outside my house. I looked out the window and saw a figure standing in my yard. My heart almost stopped. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the person was gone. The police put a patrol car outside my house, but I still didn't feel safe. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to happen. A week later, the police raided the school. They arrested the principal, Mr. Thompson, and a few other staff members. They found evidence of the child abuse ring and took the kids into protective custody. It was over, but I still couldn't shake the fear. Even though the people responsible were arrested, I didn't feel safe. I decided to leave the village and move back to the city. It was hard leaving the kids, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I couldn't risk my life. It took a long time for me to feel normal again. I still have nightmares about that time, but I try to remind myself that I did the right thing. I helped those kids and I stopped something terrible from continuing. Story 2. The classic car nightmare. I always wanted a classic car. It was a dream of mine for years. So, when I found one for sale in Philadelphia, I jumped at the chance. It was a 1967 Mustang in pretty good shape, and the price was reasonable. The seller, a guy named Mike, seemed nice enough. He was eager to sell and told me he needed the money quickly. I didn't ask too many questions. I met Mike at a rundown garage on the outskirts of town. The place looked abandoned, but the Mustang was there, gleaming under a layer of dust. We made the deal and he handed over the keys. I drove the car home, feeling like I had just scored the deal of a lifetime. The first sign of trouble came the next day. I was at a red light when a black SUV pulled up beside me. The window rolled down and a guy inside stared at me hard. I looked away, trying to ignore him, but I could feel his eyes burning into me. The light turned green and I drove off quickly, but the SUV followed me for several blocks before finally turning away. That night, I heard noises outside my house. It sounded like someone was messing with the car. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check, but by the time I got outside, no one was there. The car was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, I was driving to work when the SUV appeared again. This time, it was right on my tail. I tried to lose them, weaving through traffic, but they stayed with me. Finally, I pulled into a crowded parking lot and ran inside a store, hoping they wouldn't follow. They didn't, but when I came back out, there was a note on my windshield. It said, "We know who you are." I decided to call Mike. His phone went straight to voicemail. I tried a few more times, but had no luck. I started to get really worried. That evening, I noticed the SUV parked down the street from my house. They were watching me. The next morning, I found my tires slashed. I called a tow truck and had the car taken to a nearby garage. The mechanic told me it would take a few days to get new tires and fix some other minor issues. I felt a bit of relief, thinking maybe things would calm down without the car around. But that night, someone broke into my house. I woke up to the sound of shattering glass and footsteps downstairs. I grabbed a baseball bat and crept down the stairs, heart pounding. There were two men in my living room rummaging through my stuff. They saw me and one of them lunged. I swung the bat, hitting him in the side. He went down, but the other guy pulled a knife. I backed up, trying to keep the bat between us. He slashed at me, and I felt a sharp pain in my arm. I swung the bat again, hitting his arm and knocking the knife away. He tackled me, and we both went down hard. I managed to get on top of him and hit him again until he stopped moving. I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived within minutes, arrested the two men. I was taken to the hospital where I got stitches for the cut on my arm. The police questioned me about the men, but I didn't know anything. They took my statement and promised to look into it. A few days later, I got a call from a detective. He told me that the men who broke into my house were part of a gang, and they were looking for something they thought Mike had left in the car. He wouldn't say what, but it sounded serious. The detective advised me to stay somewhere safe until they could sort things out. I stayed with a friend for a while, hoping the police would catch the rest of the gang. They kept the Mustang as evidence, which was fine by me. I didn't want anything to do with it anymore. Eventually, the police busted the gang and things started to calm down. They returned the car, but I sold it as soon as I could. I didn't want any more Story 3. The Haunted Necklace. I had been searching for a unique piece of jewelry for months, something special that I could wear on my birthday. After browsing countless stores and websites, I found a beautiful necklace on Craigslist. It was a vintage piece with a delicate design, and the price was surprisingly reasonable. The seller, a woman named Karen, seemed polite and responsive through our emails. We arranged to meet at a cafe in downtown Phoenix. The cafe was busy when I arrived, bustling with people enjoying their Saturday morning coffee. Karen was already there, sitting at a table near the window. She looked normal, mid-30s, dressed casually. We exchanged pleasantries, and she handed me the necklace. It was even more beautiful in person, and I couldn't believe my luck. After a bit of small talk, I handed her the cash, and she left with a friendly wave. Feeling thrilled with my purchase, I wore the necklace that evening. It drew compliments from friends at my birthday dinner, and I felt a special connection to it. Over the next few days, I noticed a few strange things. Once, I thought I saw someone following me while I was out shopping. Another time, my car alarm went off in the middle of the night, but there was no sign of forced entry. I dismissed these incidents as coincidences, not thinking they were related. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise outside my apartment window. I lived on the ground floor, and the sound was distinct, like someone trying to open the window. My heart raced, and I grabbed my phone to call the police. Before I could dial, the noise stopped. I peered through the blinds but saw nothing. It took me hours to fall asleep, my mind racing with possibilities. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to stay home from work and keep an eye on my apartment. Around noon, I saw a man loitering across the street. He was wearing a hoodie and sunglasses, standing too casually for too long. I watched him from behind the curtains, and after what felt like forever, he walked away. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, but the fear lingered. That evening, I received a message from an unknown number. It said, "Enjoying the necklace?" My blood ran cold. How did they know? I replied asking who it was, but got no response. I decided to call Karen, thinking maybe she had given my number to someone. The phone rang, but no one answered. I left a message explaining the situation and asking her to call me back. Hours later, I heard a knock on my door. It was Karen. She looked different, more anxious than the cheerful woman I met at the cafe. She said she needed to talk. I let her in, and she immediately asked if anyone had contacted me about the necklace. I showed her the message, and she sighed, looking terrified. Karen explained that the necklace wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It belonged to a dangerous man she had once been involved with. She stole it from him to escape their relationship and sold it to me to cover her tracks. Now it seemed he had found out and was coming after both of us. My fear turned into panic as she spoke. Realizing the danger I was in, we decided to go to the police. At the station, we explained everything, from the sale of the necklace to the threatening message. The officers took our statements seriously and advised us to stay somewhere safe. They would investigate, but there was no guarantee they could catch the man quickly. Karen and I left the station feeling a bit more secure but still on edge. She suggested we stay at her friend's place out of town for a few days. We packed our essentials and drove to her friend's house, a small secluded place in the desert. The isolation was eerie, but we felt safer away from the city. The first night was restless, every sound outside making us jump. In the morning, we discussed our next steps. Karen remembered a safe deposit box where she had hidden some documents that might help the police track down her ex. We decided to retrieve them despite the risk. Driving back to the city, we were cautious, checking for anyone following us. At the bank, Karen retrieved the documents without issue. As we left, I noticed a familiar figure in the parking lot, the man in the hoodie. My heart pounded as we hurried back to the car and sped off. Back at the house, we handed the documents to the police. They assured us they would use them to locate the man and urged us to stay hidden. That night, the isolation of the desert felt more like a prison. We barely slept, every creak and groan of the house setting us on edge. Early the next morning, we were jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. He had found us. We ran to the back door, but he was already inside, his face twisted with rage. Karen screamed, and I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and swung it at him. He staggered but didn't fall. In the chaos, Karen managed to grab her phone and call 911. We barricaded ourselves in a bedroom, pushing furniture against the door. He pounded on it, shouting threats. The minutes felt like hours until we heard the distant wail of sirens. The man's shouts turned to curses and then silence. We stayed put, trembling, until we heard the police announcing themselves. They found him hiding in the house and arrested him. The officers escorted us out, assuring us we were safe now. The relief was overwhelming, but the trauma of the experience lingered. Karen and I decided to part ways for our safety. I moved to a different apartment, changed my number, and tried to rebuild my sense of security. Months later, I still have the necklace, a reminder of the ordeal. Story 4. The Mysterious Mark. I moved to a small town in Ohio a few months ago. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and I thought it would be a good place to start over. I got a job at the local diner, and it didn't take long for me to feel like part of the community. People were friendly and welcoming. One evening, a man named Mark came into the diner. He was charming and good-looking, with a smile that made my heart race. He started coming in regularly, and we struck up conversations. Soon enough, he asked me out on a date. I was thrilled. He seemed perfect. Our relationship moved quickly. Mark was attentive and sweet, always making me feel special. He told me he was new in town too, looking for a fresh start after a rough patch in his life. I didn't press for details, thinking we all had our pasts. One night, we were watching a movie at his place when there was a loud knock on the door. Mark's face turned pale, and he told me to stay quiet. He went to the door and spoke in hushed tones with whoever was outside. I couldn't hear much, but I caught the words trouble and leave. When he came back, he tried to brush it off, saying it was just a friend needing help, but I could tell he was shaken. Over the next few days, Mark became more anxious and jumpy. He avoided answering his phone and seemed to be watching over his shoulder constantly. I asked him what was wrong, but he kept saying it was nothing. I started to feel uneasy. Something wasn't right. Then, one afternoon, I was cleaning up at the diner when I overheard two regulars talking about a news story. They mentioned a fugitive from another state who was wanted for serious crimes. My heart sank when they described him. It sounded a lot like Mark. I felt sick. Could it really be him? That evening, I went to Mark's place, determined to confront him. I found him packing a bag. He looked up, and I saw fear in his eyes. He admitted it. He told me he had been running from his past, trying to build a new life, but now it was catching up with him. He begged me to come with him, to leave everything behind and start over somewhere else. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run away with him, but I was also terrified. I told him I needed time to think and left his place, promising to call him later. I drove around aimlessly, my mind racing. Finally, I decided to go to the police. They needed to know, and I needed to be safe. At the station, I told them everything. They took me seriously and assured me they would handle it. They asked me to stay somewhere safe and out of sight. I decided to stay with a friend for the night. Around midnight, my phone rang. It was Mark. His voice was frantic. He knew I had gone to the police. He was furious and scared. He said he was coming for me. My heart pounded. Immediately. We waited in the dark, every sound making us jump. Minutes felt like hours. Then we heard footsteps outside. My friend whispered that the police were on their way, but I wasn't sure they would get there in time. Suddenly, there was a loud banging on the door. Mark was shouting my name, demanding I come out. I felt trapped. My friend grabbed a kitchen knife and stood by the door, ready to defend us. The banging got louder, more frantic. I could hear Mark's anger and desperation. I was terrified he would break the door down. Then sirens, red and blue lights flashed outside. The banging stopped, replaced by shouting and commotion. The police had arrived just in time. They arrested Mark, who was still yelling and struggling. I felt a wave of relief, but also sadness. This was the man I had fallen for, now being taken away and handcuffed. The police thanked me for coming forward. They said I had done the right thing, but it didn't feel like it. I was heartbroken and scared, unsure of what the future held. I stayed with my friend for a few more days, trying to process everything. Life in the small town changed after that. People knew what had happened, and while they were supportive, I felt the weight of their pity. It was hard to move on, but I knew I had to. I focused on my job, my friends, and slowly started to rebuild my life. Mark's trial was swift. He was sentenced to a long time in prison for his past crimes. I never saw him again. The experience left me wary and cautious, but I learned to trust my instincts and value my safety above all. Story 5. The motorcycle sale. I decided to sell my motorcycle. It wasn't anything fancy, but I needed the money. I put up an ad on Craigslist and waited. It didn't take long for someone to respond. His name was Mike, and he seemed like a nice enough guy. We exchanged a few emails, and he agreed to come over and take a look. Mike showed up right on time. He was a tall guy with a friendly smile. We chatted a bit about the bike, and he seemed genuinely interested. After a short test ride, he agreed to buy it. He handed me the cash, and I gave him the keys and the title. Everything seemed fine, and I was relieved the sale went smoothly. A few days later, I started getting strange texts from Mike. He said the bike wasn't running properly and accused me of selling him a lemon. I apologized and told him it had always worked fine for me. He didn't seem satisfied and kept sending messages. The tone of his texts got angrier, and he started accusing me of scamming him. I tried to ignore the texts, hoping he would give up, but then I started noticing a car parked outside my apartment building. It was there every night, and I had a feeling it was Mike. One evening, as I was walking home from work, I saw the car again. This time, I saw Mike sitting inside, staring right at me. My heart raced, and I quickly went inside, locking the door behind me. The text from Mike continued, becoming more threatening. He said he knew where I lived and that he would make me pay. I decided to call the police. They took my report but said there wasn't much they could do unless he actually did something. That didn't make me feel any safer. The next night, I heard noises outside my window. I peeked through the blinds and saw Mike in my yard, looking around. I called the police again, and this time they arrived quickly. They found Mike in my yard and questioned him. He claimed he was just there to talk to me about the bike. The police warned him to stay away from me and let him go. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. The following evening, I came home to find my front door slightly open. My stomach dropped. I cautiously stepped inside and saw that my place had been trashed. Drawers were pulled out, papers scattered everywhere. I called the police again, and they came to investigate. I told them about Mike, but they couldn't find any evidence linking him to the break-in. I was terrified. I couldn't stay there anymore, so I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend for the next few days. I lived in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't hear from Mike, and the car outside my apartment was gone. I started to relax, thinking maybe he had given up. One night, while staying at my friend's place, I woke up to a noise outside the window. I crept over and looked out. There was Mike, staring right at me. I felt a wave of panic. I woke my friend and we called the police. They arrived quickly and caught Mike trying to break in. This time, they arrested him. Mike was charged with stalking and attempted burglary. I had to testify in court, which was terrifying, but I was relieved when he was sentenced to jail time. Story 6. The Haunted Hotel Room. I worked as a receptionist at a small hotel, a quiet place on the edge of town. Most nights were uneventful, with few guests and nothing much happening. That changed when the guest in room 213 checked in. The man seemed ordinary enough, checked in late at night, didn't say much. He paid for a week up front, then took his key and went to his room. I didn't think much of it at first. We had guests like him all the time. After a few days, I realized I hadn't seen him since he checked in. Normally, guests would come and go, at least leave the room for meals or a walk. But room 213 was silent. No sound, no movement. It started to bother me. I checked the computer and saw that his key card hadn't been used to leave or enter the room since the night he arrived. I thought maybe he was just keeping to himself, but it still seemed strange. On the fourth day, I decided to check on him. I knocked on the door of room 213, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. I considered using the master key, but I didn't want to invade his privacy. I went back to the front desk, still feeling uneasy. Later that night, I noticed something even stranger. The lock record showed the door to room 213 had been opened several times during the past few days, but not by the guest key card. It was opened by the master key, the one only staff had access to. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been entering room 213, but it wasn't the guest. I decided to wait until my shift ended and then go check the room myself. At the end of my shift, I grabbed the master key and headed up to the second floor. The hallway was silent, the dim lights flickering slightly. I reached room 213 and took a deep breath before unlocking the door. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. I fumbled for the light switch and turned it on. The bed was made. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but then I noticed the closet door was slightly ajar. I walked over to the closet and pulled the door open. Inside, I found a pile of clothes that didn't belong to the guest. Men's and women's clothing, all mixed together. There was also a strange smell, like something rotten. My heart was pounding as I turned around to check the bathroom. The door was closed, and I could see a faint light coming from underneath. I knocked, but there was no response. I slowly pushed the door open and was hit by the stench of decay. The guest was there, lying in the bathtub, eyes wide open but lifeless. His skin was pale, and he looked like he had been dead for days. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. That's when I heard a noise behind me. I turned around and saw a man standing in the doorway. He wasn't a guest. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face partially hidden by a hood. "Who are you?" I managed to stammer. The man didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes cold and empty. I tried to run, but he was faster. He grabbed me by the arm and pulled me into the room, slamming the door shut. I struggled, but he was too strong. "Stay quiet," he hissed, "or you'll end up like him." I nodded, too terrified to do anything else. He let go of me and started searching the room, pulling out drawers, tossing things around. I didn't know what he was looking for, but I knew I had to get out of there. I waited until he was distracted, then made a dash for the door. I managed to unlock it and ran down the hallway, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I was outside in the parking lot, gasping for breath. I called the police, and they arrived within minutes. They searched the room and found the man hiding in the closet. He was arrested, and the police later told me he was wanted for multiple murders. The guest in room 213 had been one of his victims. Never went back to that hotel. I couldn't. The memory of that night still haunts me. The feeling of being watched, the smell of death, the cold eyes of a killer. I'll never forget it, and I hope no one else ever has to go through something like that. Story 7. The storm at the train station. I was stuck at the train station during one of the worst storms I had ever seen. The rain was pounding against the windows, and the wind howled like a wild animal. I had missed my train home, and the next one wasn't due for hours. The station was almost empty, just me and a few other unlucky souls stranded by the weather. I sat on a cold metal bench, watching the rain. The lights flickered occasionally, making the shadows in the corners dance. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and tried to get comfortable, but the bench was hard and the air was damp and chill. After a while, I noticed a man walking towards me. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark uniform. I assumed he was a security guard, though I hadn't seen him before. He had a badge clipped to his chest and a flashlight in his hand. "Evening," he said, his voice deep and slightly raspy. You waiting for the next train? Yeah, I replied. Got stuck here because of the storm. Bad one, isn't it? He glanced at the windows, the rain still hammering down. Name's Carl. I'm the new security here. I'm Laura, I said. Nice to meet you. He nodded and sat down on the bench across from me. His presence was a bit unsettling, but I figured he was just doing his job. We sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the storm. Not many people here tonight, he said finally, looking around the empty station. Most folks cleared out before it got this bad. Yeah, it's pretty deserted, I agreed. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. So, Laura, where are you headed? Home, I said. Just trying to get home. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving my face. You know, it's not safe for a young woman to be alone in a place like this. Lots of strange people around. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy. I'm fine, I said quickly. Just waiting for my train. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Well, if you need anything, I'll be around. He stood up and walked away, his boots echoing on the tiled floor. I watched him disappear into the shadows, feeling a sense of relief once he was gone. But the relief didn't last long. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but I couldn't focus. Every time the lights flickered, I glanced around, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. The minutes dragged on, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to stretch my legs. I walked down the platform, trying to shake off the unease. As I passed a row of lockers, I heard a noise behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. Just the empty station and the sound of the storm. I told myself I was being paranoid. There was no reason to be scared. But as I turned to head back to my bench, I saw him again, Carl, standing at the far end of the platform, watching me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were dark and intense. I forced a smile and nodded at him, hoping to appear calm. He didn't respond, just kept staring. I hurried back to my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. I needed to find a way out of there, but with the storm raging outside, I had nowhere to go. I decided to go to the restroom, hoping to buy some time and gather my thoughts. The restroom was down a dimly lit hallway, and as I walked, I felt like I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. Inside the restroom, I splashed some water on my face and took a deep breath. I needed to stay calm and think clearly, but when I stepped out, Carl was there, leaning against the wall. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "Yeah, just needed a break," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He took a step closer, and I could see the cold glint in his eyes. "You know, the storm's getting worse. Might be a good idea to find somewhere safer to wait." "I'm fine here," I insisted, backing away. His smile faded, replaced by a hard, menacing look. "I don't think you understand. It's not safe here." My heart was racing now. I needed to get away from him. "I'll take my chances," I said, turning to leave. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight and painful. "I'm not giving you a choice," he growled. I yanked my arm free and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty station. I could hear him behind me, his boots pounding on the floor. I didn't know where to go, but I had to get away. I darted down the hallway and into a storage room, slamming the door shut behind me. I looked around, my eyes searching for something to block the door. I spotted a heavy shelf and pushed it against the door, my hands shaking. I could hear Carl outside, trying the handle, then pounding on the door. "Let me in, Laura," he shouted. "You're only making this harder on yourself." I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I needed to find a way to call for help. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell towers. I was trapped. I heard a crash outside and realized he was trying to break down the door. I had to think fast. I looked around the room and spotted a small window near the ceiling. It was a tight fit, but it was my only chance. I climbed up on a stack of boxes and pushed the window open. The rain and wind hit me immediately, but I didn't care. I squeezed through the window, cutting my hands on the glass, and dropped down onto the wet pavement outside. I could hear Carl shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran through the storm, my clothes soaked and my heart pounding. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away from him. I finally saw the lights of a nearby building and ran towards it. It was a small diner, and the sight of it filled me with relief. I burst through the door, gasping for breath. The few people inside turned to look at me, their faces filled with concern. "Help," I managed to say. "There's a man. He's after me." The staff quickly called the police, and they arrived within minutes. I told them everything, and they assured me I was safe now. They found Carl still trying to break into the storage room, and he was arrested. The ordeal left me shaken, but I was grateful to be alive. I never thought a simple trip could turn into a nightmare, but it did. I'll never forget the look in Carl's eyes, the fear and anger. It's something that will haunt me forever. Story 8. The Camping Horror. I decided to camp alone on a remote beach in Florida. I wanted to get away from everything for a few days, clear my head, and enjoy some peace. I brought my boat, some supplies, and set up camp right by the water. The first day was perfect. The weather was warm, and the sound of the waves was soothing. I spent the day fishing, swimming, and just relaxing. As the sun set, I made a fire and cooked the fish I caught. I felt at peace, away from the noise and stress of daily life. The night was clear and the stars were bright. I stayed up for a while, just enjoying the quiet, before heading to my tent to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind or an animal, but then I heard it again. It was a soft rustling, like someone walking on the sand. I unzipped my tent and peered outside, but I couldn't see anything. The fire had died down to embers, and everything was dark. I listened for a while longer, but the sound stopped, so I went back to sleep. When I woke up in the morning, I felt uneasy. I got out of my tent and walked down to the water. My boat was gone. Panic hit me like a punch in the gut. I looked around and saw footprints all around my tent. They weren't mine. Someone had been here during the night. I tried to calm down and think. I was on a small island, miles from the mainland. Without my boat, I was stranded. I had enough food and water for a couple of days, but after that, I would be in trouble. I had to find a way to escape. I spent the day looking for any sign of my boat. I walked around the entire island, but there was no trace of it. The footprints led to the water and then disappeared. It was like whoever took it vanished into thin air. I felt a growing sense of dread. I was completely alone, and someone had intentionally left me here. That night, I built a larger fire, hoping it would deter anyone from coming near my camp. I didn't sleep much, jumping at every sound. The wind rustled the leaves and the waves crashed on the shore, but every noise seemed amplified. My mind kept going back to the footprints and the missing boat. The next morning, I decided to explore the island more thoroughly. Maybe there was something I had missed. I found an old path leading into the trees and followed it. It led to a small clearing with an abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been there for years, falling apart and covered in vines. Inside the cabin, I found a few old tools and a dusty, moldy mattress. There was nothing that could help me. As I was about to leave, I noticed a small carved symbol on the wall. It looked recent, and it sent a shiver down my spine. Someone had been here not long ago. I hurried back to my camp, feeling more paranoid than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I sat by the fire, clutching a makeshift spear I had fashioned from a piece of driftwood. The hours dragged by, and every shadow seemed to move. Just before dawn, I heard the sound again, footsteps coming from the direction of the cabin. I stood up, heart pounding, and peered into the darkness. I could barely make out a figure moving toward me. They stopped at the edge of the firelight, just out of reach. "Who are you?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they took a step forward into the light. It was a man, his face hidden in the shadows. He just stood there, staring at me. I tightened my grip on the spear, ready to defend myself. "What do you want?" I demanded. Still no answer. The man just stood there, watching me. Then, without warning, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't follow. I was too scared to move. When the sun finally rose, I felt a small sense of relief. I needed to find a way off this island before the man came back. I decided to build a raft from the driftwood scattered along the beach. It took all day, but I managed to lash together enough pieces to make something that might float. As night fell, I dragged the raft to the water's edge. I didn't know if it would hold, but I had to try. I pushed it into the water and climbed on. It wobbled but stayed afloat. I used a piece of wood as a paddle and started making my way toward the mainland. The water was calm, but the journey was slow. Every splash of the paddle echoed in the silence, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the man following me. Hours passed, and I began to lose hope. The mainland still seemed so far away. Just as I was about to give up, I saw lights on the horizon. I paddled with renewed energy, the lights growing brighter and closer. Eventually, I reached the shore, exhausted but alive. I stumbled onto the beach and collapsed, grateful to be off the island. I never found out who the man was or why he took my boat. I moved to a new place and tried to forget about the island, but the memory still haunts me. I learned to be more cautious and always keep an eye out for danger. The peace I had sought turned into a nightmare, and it changed me forever. Story 9. The Motel Room Secret. I was staying at an old motel just off the highway. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was cheap, and I needed a place to crash for the night. The room smelled a little musty, and the carpet had seen better days, but it was fine for one night. I dropped my bag on the bed and decided to take a shower to wash off the long drive. After my shower, I was getting ready for bed when I heard a weird noise. It sounded like something scraping against the wall. I figured it was just the pipes or something, but it kept happening. It was coming from the closet. I opened the closet door, expecting to see a rat or something, but it was empty. Then I noticed a small crack in the back wall. Curious, I pushed on the wall, and to my surprise, it moved. There was a hidden door. My heart was racing as I pushed it open and found a narrow passage behind it. It was dark, and the air was colder back there. I hesitated but grabbed my phone for light and stepped inside. The passage was tight, and I had to crouch to get through. The walls were rough, and it smelled damp. As I moved further in, I found another door, this one made of metal. It creaked loudly when I opened it, and I stepped into a larger space, like a tunnel. There were more doors along the sides, and a faint light was coming from the end of the tunnel. I walked slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The tunnel led to a room that looked like some kind of office. There were papers and photos scattered everywhere. I picked up a photo and felt my stomach drop. It was a picture of a woman tied up and gagged. She looked terrified. I dropped the photo and backed away, feeling sick. I needed to get out of there, but I heard voices coming from another tunnel. I ducked behind a stack of boxes, my heart pounding in my chest. Two men walked in, dressed in uniforms like the motel staff. They were talking about needing to clean up before morning. I felt a chill run down my spine. These guys were the ones doing this. I waited until they left, then moved quickly, trying to find my way back. The tunnels were like a maze, and I was getting turned around. I found another room, this one with a row of lockers. One of the lockers was slightly open, and inside, I saw a pile of wallets and purses. These belonged to the people in the photos. I finally found the passage that led back to my room. I slipped through and closed the hidden door behind me, my hands shaking. I needed to get out of there and call the police. I grabbed my bag and opened the door to my room, but one of the men from the tunnels was standing there. He looked as shocked as I felt. I tried to play it cool, saying I was just going out for a drink, but he grabbed my arm and pulled me back into the room. I struggled, but he was strong. He dragged me towards the closet, but I kicked and screamed, knocking over a lamp. The noise must have startled him because he let go for a second, and I ran. I sprinted down the hall and out the front door of the motel. I didn't stop running until I reached a gas station down the road. I burst in, panting and terrified, and told the clerk to call the police. I must have looked crazy, but he called them. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They went back to the motel, and I waited, shaking and scared. It felt like hours before they came back. They found the tunnels and the evidence. The men were arrested, and the motel was shut down. It took a while for me to feel safe again. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't escaped. I was just lucky I found that passage and got out in time. I still get nightmares about it sometimes. Now I always check the room before I settle in, and I stay away from old motels. I'll never forget that night. Story 10. The pickup truck. Exploring the outback had always been a dream of mine. After a few days in Sydney, I rented a car and drove out into the vast wilderness. The scenery was breathtaking, with red dirt roads stretching out to the horizon and the occasional kangaroo hopping by. It felt like an adventure I had always wanted. One afternoon, I pulled over at a small roadside stop to stretch my legs. As I was getting back into my car, an old pickup truck pulled up beside me. The driver was a middle-aged man with a friendly smile. He struck up a conversation, asking where I was headed. We chatted for a bit, and he offered to show me a shortcut to a beautiful secluded spot he said tourists rarely visited. I hesitated, but he seemed genuine enough, so I agreed to follow him. We drove for about an hour, further and further away from the main road. The landscape became more desolate, and I started feeling uneasy. Finally, he pulled over and signaled for me to do the same. I got out of my car, and he pointed to a dirt track leading into the bush. "Just a short walk that way," he said, "and you'll find a hidden gem." I thanked him and walked down the track as he drove away. After a few minutes, I realized I couldn't see the road anymore. There was no hidden gem, just endless bushland. Panic set in when I tried to retrace my steps and found the path had disappeared. I was alone in the middle of nowhere. I shouted for help, but there was no response. My phone had no signal, and I had no idea which direction to go. Hours passed as I wandered, the sun beating down on me. I regretted not bringing more water. My mouth was dry, and I could feel the first signs of dehydration setting in. As night fell, the temperature dropped. I found a spot under a tree and tried to rest, but every sound made me jump. The rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals. Everything seemed like a threat. I barely slept, my mind racing with thoughts of how I had been so easily fooled. In the morning, I decided to keep walking, hoping to find some sign of civilization. My legs were sore, and my feet were blistered, but I pushed on. Around midday, I stumbled upon an old abandoned shack. It looked like it had been empty for years, but I went inside, desperate for shelter. The shack provided little comfort. The roof leaked, and the floor was covered in dirt and debris. I found an old rusted canteen and hoped there was still water in it. It tasted foul, but I drank it anyway. I needed to stay alive. Days passed in a blur. I rationed the little water I had and ate whatever scraps I could find. I kept hoping someone would find me, but no one came. My strength was fading, and I knew I couldn't last much longer. On the fifth day, I heard a noise outside the shack. I crawled to the door and saw a figure in the distance. Summoning all my remaining energy, I shouted for help. The figure turned and started running towards me. As they got closer, I saw it was a young woman with a backpack. She looked shocked to see me. She gave me water and food, and I told her my story. She was a backpacker like me and had gotten lost while hiking. We decided to stick together and try to find our way back. With her help, we navigated through the bush, finding signs of a trail. After 2 days, we stumbled upon a ranger station. The rangers were surprised to see us and quickly provided medical attention. They contacted the local authorities, and I was taken to a nearby hospital to recover. As I lay in the hospital bed, I reflected on my ordeal. The friendly local who had abandoned me was nowhere to be found. The rangers said it wasn't the first time something like this had happened. I was grateful to be alive, but the experience had changed me. I eventually made it back home, safe but scarred. The outback was no longer the adventure I had dreamed of. It was a harsh, unforgiving place that had nearly taken my life. Story 11. The Ozarks Terror. It was supposed to be a peaceful night in the remote part of the Ozarks. I parked my camper van by the edge of a dense forest, looking forward to a quiet evening under the stars. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I noticed movement in the trees, shadows flitting in and out of view. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, but as the hours passed, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I heard footsteps outside my van, slow and deliberate, as if someone was trying to be stealthy. My heart pounded in my chest as I peered out the window, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever was lurking in the darkness. To my horror, I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't make out their features in the dim light, but I could feel their gaze burning into me. I tried to convince myself that it was just a curious local, maybe a hunter or a hiker passing through. But deep down, I knew that something was seriously wrong. There was an air of menace about the figure, a sense of danger that I couldn't ignore. I debated whether to call out to them, to confront them and demand to know what they wanted, but fear held me back. The knowledge that I was alone in the middle of nowhere, with no one to help me if things went south, paralyzed me. As the night dragged on, the figure continued to watch me from the shadows, their presence a constant source of dread. I tried to distract myself, to focus on anything other than the creeping sense of fear that threatened to overwhelm me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, that I was nothing more than prey to whatever lurked in the darkness outside my van. Hours passed in agonizing silence, each minute stretching into eternity as I waited for the first light of dawn to break through the trees. And when it finally did, I breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that I had survived the night. But as I prepared to leave the safety of my van and venture out into the daylight, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl, the sound of something primal and predatory. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest as I realized I was not alone. Whatever had been stalking me in the night was still out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. With trembling hands, I reached for the keys to my van, my fingers fumbling with the lock as I desperately tried to get inside. But before I could escape, I felt a pair of eyes watching me from the darkness, their gaze burning into my soul with a hunger that chilled me to the bone. And then, without warning, the figure stepped out from the shadows, revealing themselves in all their terrifying glory. It was a man, his face twisted into a sinister grin as he advanced toward me with slow, deliberate steps. I knew in that moment that I was in grave danger, that this man meant me harm and would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. I scrambled to start the engine of my van, my heart racing as I prayed for a miracle. But as the man drew closer, I knew that I was running out of time. With one final burst of adrenaline, I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal and peeled out of the campsite, leaving the man behind in a cloud of dust and gravel. As I drove away from the scene, my heart still pounding in my chest, I vowed never to return to that remote part of the Ozarks again. The peace I had sought turned into a nightmare, and it changed me forever. Story 12. The Family Reunion. My family decided to have a reunion at our lake house in Minnesota. It had been years since we were all together, and the idea of spending a week by the lake sounded perfect. The house was big, with plenty of rooms and a great view of the water. My grandfather, the family patriarch, was especially excited. He loved having everyone around. We arrived on a sunny afternoon and everyone started catching up. There was a lot of laughter and good food. The first couple of days were relaxing. We swam, fished, and took long walks. Everything seemed perfect, but I noticed some tension between my Uncle Dave and my grandfather. They were often whispering in heated conversations. One evening, I couldn't sleep and went downstairs to get some water. As I walked past the study, I heard voices. My Uncle Dave was talking to someone on the phone. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to understand he was talking about my grandfather and money. He sounded angry and desperate. I felt a chill run down my spine, but decided to keep quiet and go back to bed. The next day, things seemed normal, but I couldn't shake off what I heard. I started paying more attention to my uncle. He was always watching my grandfather, especially when he was near the lake. It made me uneasy. I confided in my cousin Sarah, and she told me she had also noticed something strange about Dave. We decided to keep an eye on him together. That night, we stayed up late, pretending to watch TV, but really we were listening for anything unusual. Around midnight, we heard the back door creak open. We peeked out the window and saw Dave heading towards the lake. We followed him quietly, staying hidden in the shadows. He stopped at the dock and pulled out a small bottle from his pocket, pouring its contents into my grandfather's drink bottle that he always took on his morning walks. My heart was racing. We ran back to the house and debated what to do. We couldn't confront him without proof, and we didn't want to cause a scene without being sure. We decided to wait until morning and warn my grandfather. At dawn, we found my grandfather in the kitchen, getting ready for his walk. We told him what we saw, and he was shocked but believed us. He asked us to stay quiet and let him handle it. He took his drink bottle and walked out as usual, but instead of heading to the lake, he went to my dad's room and showed him the bottle. My dad took the bottle to a friend in town who worked at a lab. By afternoon, we had confirmation. The bottle contained poison. My grandfather called a family meeting, and with everyone gathered, he confronted Dave. At first, Dave denied everything, but when my dad showed him the lab results, he broke down and confessed. He admitted he was in serious debt and needed the inheritance. The police were called, and Dave was taken away. The family was in shock. We never imagined something like this could happen. My grandfather was shaken, but relieved that we had stopped Dave before he could do anything worse. The rest of the reunion was somber. We all felt the weight of what could have happened. My grandfather was grateful to us for paying attention and acting on our instincts. The family came together in a way we hadn't before, supporting each other through the ordeal. I left the lake house with a mix of emotions. The place I always associated with happy memories now had a dark shadow over it, but I also felt a strong bond with my family, knowing we had protected one another. Story 13. The Creepy Camper. I decided to camp alone in the dense forests of Vermont. I wanted to get away from everything for a few days and enjoy the beauty of nature. I parked my camper van in a secluded spot, surrounded by tall trees and the sounds of the forest. The first day was peaceful. I hiked, fished, and relaxed by the fire. As night fell, I settled into my van, looking forward to a quiet night. But as darkness enveloped the forest, I began to feel uneasy. I heard rustling outside, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching my van. My heart skipped a beat as I peered out the window, trying to make out the figure in the darkness. To my horror, I saw a man standing outside my van. His face was obscured by shadows, but he looked disheveled and desperate, like he had been on the run for days. When he caught sight of me, his eyes widened with recognition, as if he had been expecting me all along. Before I could react, he pounded on the door of my van, demanding that I let him in. His voice was urgent and panicked, sending a chill down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but the desperation in his voice was impossible to ignore. With a trembling hand, I unlocked the door and let the man inside. He wasted no time scrambling into the van, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he collapsed onto the floor. His whole body was trembling with fear, and I could see the wild look of terror in his eyes. As he caught his breath, the man explained that he was a fugitive on the run from the authorities for a crime he claimed he didn't commit. He begged me to help him escape, promising that he would pay me handsomely for my assistance. I was torn. On one hand, I sympathized with the man's plight, but on the other hand, I knew that helping a fugitive could land me in serious trouble with the law. I tried to reason with him, to convince him to turn himself in and face justice, but he was adamant. With no other options, I reluctantly agreed to help the man escape. We drove through the night, sticking to back roads and deserted highways in an effort to avoid detection. Every sound outside the van made my heart race, fearing that we would be discovered at any moment. But despite our efforts to remain undetected, it soon became clear that we were being followed. The headlights of a car appeared in the rearview mirror, growing closer with every passing mile. My pulse quickened as the car drew nearer, and I knew that we were running out of time. The fugitive's fear was palpable, and I could see the desperation in his eyes. With a sinking feeling, I realized that we had no choice but to confront our pursuers head-on. I pulled the van to the side of the road, and the fugitive and I braced ourselves for what was to come. The car behind us slowed to a stop, and two men stepped out, their faces hidden by the shadows of the night. As they approached the van, I felt a surge of dread, knowing that we were about to face our fate. The men demanded that we hand over the fugitive, their voices cold and menacing. I knew that we had no chance of fighting them off, so I reluctantly opened the door and let them take him. The fugitive fought back with all his strength, but he was no match for the men who overpowered him and dragged him away. As I watched them drive off into the night, a sense of helplessness washed over me. I had tried to do the right thing, but in the end, it had all been for nothing. The fugitive's fate was sealed, and I was left alone in the darkness, haunted by the events of the night. I returned to the campsite, my heart heavy with the weight of what had transpired. The forest that had once seemed so peaceful now felt menacing and oppressive, and I knew that I could never return to this place again. The memory of that night would stay with me forever, a stark reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows. Story 14. The Hidden Cabin. I inherited a cabin deep in the woods of Washington from my grandfather. He had always talked about it as a place of peace and solitude, where he went to escape the world. After he passed away, I decided to visit the cabin to see if it could be my own escape. The drive was long and the road narrow, but I finally arrived at the secluded spot. The cabin was rustic and charming, just as I remembered from childhood visits. I spent the first day cleaning and organizing, feeling a sense of nostalgia as I went through my grandfather's belongings. As the sun set, I settled in for the night, the forest around me alive with the sounds of nature. It was peaceful, and I felt a deep sense of connection to my grandfather. The next day, I decided to explore the woods surrounding the cabin. I found old trails that led to hidden clearings and babbling brooks. It was beautiful and serene, a perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of daily life. I spent the afternoon fishing in a nearby stream, catching enough for a delicious dinner. As night fell, I built a fire in the old stone fireplace and settled in with a book. The quiet was comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to my imagination and went to bed. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. My heart raced as I listened, trying to determine if it was just an animal or something more sinister. The footsteps grew closer, and I could hear them circling the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously peered out the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The footsteps stopped, and I held my breath, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. Minutes passed in tense silence before I heard a soft tapping on the front door. My heart pounded as I debated whether to open it. I decided to call out instead. "Who is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no response, just the sound of the wind rustling the trees. I waited a few more minutes before cautiously opening the door. There was no one there, but a small package lay on the doorstep. I picked it up and brought it inside. My curiosity piqued. The package was wrapped in old, yellowed paper and tied with a piece of twine. I carefully unwrapped it to find a leather-bound journal inside. It was my grandfather's handwriting on the cover, and my heart skipped a beat as I realized what I was holding. The journal was filled with his notes and observations about the cabin and the surrounding woods. He wrote about strange occurrences, mysterious figures, and unexplainable events that had happened over the years. As I read, I felt a growing sense of unease. My grandfather had documented countless encounters with a shadowy figure that seemed to watch him from the woods. He described the same footsteps I had heard, the feeling of being watched, and the strange tapping on the door. My blood ran cold as I realized that whatever had haunted my grandfather was now haunting me. I spent the rest of the night reading the journal, unable to sleep. My grandfather had tried to find explanations for the strange events, but he never did. The entries grew more frantic as the years went on, and it was clear that the presence in the woods had taken a toll on him. The next morning, I decided to leave the cabin. I packed my things quickly, feeling a sense of urgency. As I loaded my car, I felt eyes on me, watching from the shadows. I didn't look back as I drove away, my grandfather's journal clutched tightly in my hand. I never returned to the cabin, and I never found out what haunted those woods. The experience left me with more questions than answers, and the memory of those footsteps and the feeling of being watched still haunts me. The cabin, once a place of peace and solitude, had become a place of fear and mystery. Story 15. The Road Trip from Hell. My friends and I decided to take a road trip across the country. We had been planning it for months, and the excitement was palpable as we loaded up the car and hit the open road. The first few days were filled with laughter, music, and the thrill of adventure. We visited small towns, camped under the stars, and made memories that would last a lifetime. One evening, as we were driving through a remote part of the desert, we decided to take a detour to see an old ghost town that was marked on our map. It was late afternoon, and the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the barren landscape. The road leading to the ghost town was rough and bumpy, and our car struggled to make it through the loose sand and rocks. When we finally arrived, the town was eerily silent. The buildings were old and crumbling, covered in dust and sand. We parked the car and got out, the dry wind whipping around us. As we explored the abandoned streets, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness began to envelop the town. Suddenly, we heard a noise behind us, a soft, shuffling sound. We turned around to see a figure standing in the shadows. At first, we thought it was just another tourist, but as the figure stepped into the light, we realized it was a man dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes. His eyes were empty, and his expression was one of anger and sadness. "Who are you?" one of my friends asked, his voice trembling. The man didn't respond. Instead, he pointed towards the town's old saloon. We exchanged nervous glances but decided to follow him, our curiosity getting the better of us. As we entered the saloon, the air grew colder, and we could hear the faint sound of music and laughter, like echoes from the past. The man led us to a table in the corner where a dusty, leather-bound book lay open. He gestured for us to read it. As we flipped through the pages, we realized it was a journal detailing the town's history. It spoke of a great tragedy that had befallen the town years ago, a plague that had wiped out most of the population. The survivors had fled, leaving the town to the ghosts of the past. As we read, we noticed the man's expression growing more intense. He pointed to a page that described a group of travelers who had come to the town seeking refuge, only to meet a terrible fate. Their spirits were said to haunt the town, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to enter. Suddenly, the air grew even colder, and we heard the sound of footsteps behind us. We turned to see more figures emerging from the shadows, their faces twisted in pain and anger. Panic set in, and we backed away from the table, the journal slipping from our hands and hitting the floor with a thud. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the growing noise. We turned and ran out of the saloon, the figures following us, their eyes glowing in the darkness. We sprinted back to the car, our hearts pounding in our chests. As we reached the car, we fumbled with the keys, desperate to get inside and escape. The figures were closing in, their cold, dead hands reaching out for us. We finally managed to get the car started and sped away from the town, the headlights cutting through the darkness. As we drove, the ghostly figures faded into the distance, but the sense of dread lingered. None of us spoke, the fear still gripping us tightly. We drove through the night, not stopping until we reached the safety of a well-lit rest stop. We parked the car and sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. The ghost town and its haunted inhabitants had left a mark on us, a memory that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The road trip continued, but the carefree spirit we had started with was gone. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the ghosts of the past were still following us. We kept to well-traveled roads, avoiding any more detours or ghost towns. When we finally returned home, we were different people. The adventure we had sought had turned into a nightmare, a journey into the unknown that had left us forever changed. The memory of that ghost town and the spirits that haunted it would stay with us, a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows. Story 16. The Abandoned Amusement Park. One summer, my friends and I decided to visit an abandoned amusement park that we had heard about online. It was said to be haunted, and we were all eager for a thrill. We set out early in the morning, armed with flashlights and cameras, ready to explore the decaying rides and forgotten attractions. The park was located on the outskirts of a small town, hidden away behind a dense forest. As we approached, the tall, rusting gates loomed ahead, covered in vines and graffiti. We squeezed through a gap in the fence and entered the park, the air thick with the smell of rust and decay. The once vibrant and bustling park was now a silent wasteland. The roller coasters were covered in rust, the tracks twisted and broken. The Ferris wheel stood motionless, its seats swaying gently in the breeze. We wandered through the overgrown pathways, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. As we explored, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows seemed to move at the corner of our vision, and strange sounds echoed through the park. We tried to laugh it off, but the atmosphere was undeniably creepy. We decided to split up and explore different parts of the park. I headed towards the old funhouse, the entrance covered in faded paint and broken glass. Inside, the air was cool and damp, and the floor creaked with every step. I shone my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. The funhouse was filled with distorted mirrors, their surfaces cracked and dirty. As I moved deeper inside, I heard a faint giggle, like that of a child. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound seemed to come from behind one of the mirrors. I approached cautiously, my flashlight shaking in my hand. To my horror, I saw a small figure standing behind the mirror. It was a little girl, her eyes wide and empty, her face pale and ghostly. She stared at me, her expression one of sadness and longing. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The girl raised her hand and pointed towards the back of the funhouse. I followed her gesture, my curiosity getting the better of me. As I approached the back of the funhouse, I found a small door, partially hidden by debris. I pushed it open and entered a narrow hallway. The air grew colder, and the sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls. At the end of the hallway, I found a small room filled with old photographs and toys. The pictures showed happy families enjoying the park, but there was a darkness to them, a sense of something sinister lurking beneath the surface. I picked up one of the photos and saw the little girl from the mirror, standing with her parents. They looked happy, but their eyes were empty, just like the girl's. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart racing. When I turned it on, I saw the girl standing in front of me, her eyes filled with tears. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. The girl reached out and touched my hand, her skin cold and clammy. In that moment, I felt a surge of emotions, fear, sadness, and a deep sense of loss. The girl's image flickered, and I saw flashes of the park in its heyday, filled with laughter and joy. But then the images changed. I saw a fire, the park engulfed in flames. People were screaming, running for their lives. The girl and her family were trapped, unable to escape. The horror of their final moments washed over me, and I understood their pain. I promised the girl that I would help them find peace. As soon as I said the words, the room began to shake, and the temperature dropped even further. The girl smiled, a look of relief on her face, before fading away. The door behind me creaked open, and I hurried out, desperate to find my friends. I found them near the old carousel, their faces pale and anxious. They had experienced their own encounters with the spirits of the park. We left the amusement park as quickly as we could, the weight of the spirits suffering heavy on our hearts. We shared our stories, and we knew we had to find a way to help the lost souls find peace. We researched the history of the park, learning about the tragic fire that had claimed so many lives. We contacted the local authorities and shared our findings, hoping they could help lay the spirits to rest. Months later, the town held a memorial service for the victims of the fire. As we stood among the gathered crowd, we felt a sense of closure. The spirits of the park had finally found peace, and we knew that we had played a part in helping them move on. The experience left a lasting impact on us. We never forgot the haunted amusement park and the spirits that had reached out to us for help. It was a reminder of the past's lingering presence and the importance of honoring those who came before us. Story 17. The Cabin in the Woods. My friends and I rented a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip away from the stress of our daily lives. The cabin was cozy and rustic, nestled in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. The first day was perfect. We hiked, fished, and enjoyed the peace and quiet of the forest. As night fell, we gathered around the fireplace, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The atmosphere was warm and comforting, a stark contrast to the chill outside. As the fire crackled, we talked about everything and nothing, enjoying each other's company. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. We settled into our rooms, the sounds of the forest lulling us to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on the window. I sat up, trying to pinpoint the source. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. I got out of bed and walked to the window, my heart pounding. As I pulled back the curtain, I saw a figure standing outside, their face obscured by the darkness. They were tapping on the window, their movements slow and deliberate. I felt a surge of fear and backed away from the window. The figure continued to tap, their face pressed against the glass. I ran to wake up my friends, my heart racing. They groggily followed me to the window, their expressions turning to shock as they saw the figure. "Who is that?" one of my friends whispered, their voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, "but we need to do something." We decided to call the police, but there was no signal on our phones. The figure outside continued to tap, their movements growing more frantic. We could see their breath fogging up the glass, their eyes wide and empty. With no other options, we grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door. The cold night air hit us, and we stepped outside, our breaths visible in the chill. The figure had disappeared, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling the trees. We searched the area around the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound our footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. We returned to the cabin, locking the door behind us and securing the windows. As we sat in the living room, trying to make sense of what had happened, we heard a noise from the basement. It was a low, rumbling sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. We exchanged nervous glances, and one of my friends grabbed a fire poker for protection. We slowly descended the stairs to the basement, the sound growing louder with each step. The basement was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and boxes. In the corner, we saw a large, wooden chest that looked out of place. The chest was old and covered in dust, the metal hinges rusted and worn. We hesitated, unsure of whether to open it, but our curiosity got the better of us. We pried open the lid, revealing a collection of old, tattered clothes and personal items. As we sifted through the contents, we found a small, leather-bound diary. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. The diary belonged to a woman who had lived in the cabin years ago. She wrote about her life in the woods, her love for the cabin, and the loneliness she felt after her husband had passed away. But as we read further, the entries grew darker. She wrote about hearing strange noises in the night, feeling watched, and seeing figures in the woods. Her final entry spoke of a man who had come to the cabin, a man with empty eyes who had taken her husband and left her alone in the darkness. We realized that the figure outside the window was the same man she had written about, and that his spirit was still haunting the cabin. We felt a chill run down our spines, knowing that we were not alone. We decided to leave the cabin at first light, packing our things and waiting for dawn. The night was long and filled with tension, every noise making us jump. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, we hurried to the car and drove away, leaving the cabin and its ghosts behind. The experience left us shaken and wary of remote places. The memory of the tapping on the window and the man's empty eyes haunted our dreams. The cabin, once a place of peace and solitude, had become a place of fear and mystery. We vowed never to return, but the memory of that weekend would stay with us forever. Story 18. The Stalker. It started with the phone calls. At first, they were just hang-ups, the kind of thing that happens from time to time. But soon, they became more frequent, and then the breathing started. Heavy, labored breathing on the other end of the line. I tried to ignore it, hoping it would go away, but it didn't. The calls kept coming at all hours of the day and night. One evening, I was out with friends, trying to forget about the calls and enjoy myself. My phone rang, and I saw it was an unknown number. I didn't want to answer, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped outside to take the call, and the breathing started again. This time, it was followed by a low, raspy voice. "I'm watching you," the voice said, sending a chill down my spine. I hung up and went back inside, my heart racing. I tried to act normal, but my friends noticed something was wrong. I told them about the calls, and they tried to reassure me that it was probably just a prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Over the next few days, the calls continued, and I started to notice other things. My car was being tampered with, scratches on the doors, the tires deflated. I felt like I was being followed, constantly looking over my shoulder. I decided to go to the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. I installed security cameras around my house, hoping to catch whoever was stalking me. The first few nights, there was nothing, but then I saw him, a figure standing in my yard, watching my house. He was there for hours, just standing and watching. The police reviewed the footage but couldn't identify him. They advised me to be cautious and keep my doors and windows locked. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone tapping on my bedroom window. My heart pounded as I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. The figure was there, his face pressed against the glass. His eyes were empty, and his expression was one of cold determination. I called the police, my hands shaking, and they arrived within minutes. The figure was gone by the time they got there, leaving no trace behind. They searched the area but found nothing. I felt a sense of helplessness and fear, knowing that my stalker could be anywhere. I decided to stay with a friend for a while, hoping that being away from my house would make me feel safer. But the calls continued, and I started receiving threatening letters. The sense of dread grew stronger, and I felt like I was losing control of my life. One evening, I was walking home from work when I noticed a car following me. My heart raced as I quickened my pace, but the car kept up. I turned down a side street, hoping to lose them, but the car followed. I ducked into a nearby store, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The car drove past, and I watched from the window, my fear mounting. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I went back to the police, determined to find a way to stop the stalker. They advised me to change my phone number and install more security measures at my house. I followed their advice, hoping it would make a difference. The calls stopped for a while, and I started to feel a sense of relief. But then they started again, from a different number. The breathing, the threats, it was all the same. I felt trapped, like there was no escape from the constant fear. One night, I heard a noise outside my front door. I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept to the door, my heart pounding. As I peered through the peephole, I saw a letter on the doormat. I opened the door just enough to grab the letter and quickly shut it again. The letter was from my stalker, filled with threats and details about my life that made my blood run cold. He knew where I worked, who my friends were, and even what I had done the previous night. I felt exposed and vulnerable, like there was nowhere I could hide. Desperate, I decided to hire a private investigator. They reviewed all the evidence and started looking into my stalker's identity. It took weeks of searching, but they finally found him. He was someone I had briefly dated years ago, someone I had long since forgotten. The police arrested him, and he was charged with stalking and harassment. I felt a sense of relief knowing that he was no longer a threat, but the experience left me scarred. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, and the memory of his cold, empty eyes haunted my dreams. I took steps to rebuild my sense of safety, moving to a new house and changing my routines. It took time, but I eventually started to feel normal again. The memory of my stalker remained, a reminder of how quickly life can be turned upside down. I became more cautious, always aware of my surroundings, and grateful for the support of my friends and family. Story 19. The Haunted Doll. I had always loved collecting antiques, and one day, I came across an old doll at a flea market. It was beautiful, with porcelain skin, delicate features, and a dress that looked like it was from the 19th century. The seller told me the doll had a long history and was rumored to be haunted. I didn't believe in such things, but the doll was too beautiful to pass up. I brought the doll home and placed it on a shelf in my living room. At first, everything seemed normal, but then strange things started to happen. I would hear whispers in the middle of the night, soft and indistinct, like someone talking just out of earshot. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more. One evening, I came home from work to find the doll in a different position than I had left it. It was subtle, just a slight tilt of the head, but it was enough to make me uneasy. Over the next few days, I noticed other changes. The doll's eyes seemed to follow me around the room, and its expression would shift, sometimes looking sad, other times angry. I decided to do some research on the doll's history. I found out that it had belonged to a little girl who had died tragically in the late 1800s. The doll had been passed down through generations, and there were stories of strange occurrences and misfortunes that followed it. People claimed that the spirit of the little girl was trapped inside the doll, seeking revenge for her untimely death. As the days went on, the activity grew more intense. I would wake up to find the doll in different rooms, sometimes sitting on my bed, other times on the kitchen table. The whispers became clearer, and I could hear the voice of a little girl crying and calling out for her mother. I felt a growing sense of dread, knowing that the spirit was becoming more powerful. One night, I woke up to the sound of my name being whispered. I opened my eyes and saw the doll standing at the foot of my bed, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I felt a surge of fear and scrambled out of bed, my heart pounding. I grabbed the doll and threw it into a closet, slamming the door shut. The whispers continued, growing louder and more frantic. I knew I had to do something to get rid of the doll, but I didn't know how. I decided to contact a paranormal expert, hoping they could help me. The expert arrived the next day and immediately sensed the presence of the spirit. They performed a cleansing ritual, trying to release the spirit from the doll. As the ritual progressed, the room grew colder, and the whispers turned into screams. The doll's eyes seemed to glow even brighter, and it felt like the spirit was fighting to stay. The expert chanted and waved incense, trying to banish the spirit. Finally, with a final burst of energy, the room fell silent. The doll's eyes returned to their normal, lifeless state, and the coldness dissipated. The expert told me that the spirit had been released, and that the doll was now just an ordinary object. I felt a sense of relief, knowing that the haunting was over. I decided to keep the doll as a reminder of the experience, but I placed it in a glass case, away from the rest of my collection. The whispers stopped, and the activity ceased. The doll remained in its case, a silent witness to the events that had transpired. The memory of the haunting stayed with me, a reminder of the power of the past and the spirits that linger in the shadows. I became more cautious about the items I brought into my home, always aware of the potential for the unknown to make itself known.